Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you settled and unhurried. Tell me, is there paper near you this evening? A letter, perhaps, or a page left open? Watson always said that documents reveal more than their authors intend, that ink, once dry, cannot quite conceal the hand that guided it. If you enjoy these quiet hours of reason and reflection, do subscribe so each new investigation finds its way to you. Now, make yourself comfortable. For as Holmes understood, the truth does not hide. It waits patiently for an honest pair of eyes. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. The link is in the video description below. Chapter 1. The Merchant of Unblemished Reputation. It is a curious feature of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most instructive of all our investigations were not those which announced themselves with theatrical violence or the glamour of some exotic crime, but rather those quieter affairs in which respectable men, seated in respectable rooms, spoke with the careful gravity of persons who have already decided what has happened and require only a formality of confirmation. It was precisely such an atmosphere that greeted us on the grey October morning when Mr. Percival Lethbridge first presented himself at our rooms in Baker Street. I had breakfasted early and was engaged with the morning papers when Holmes, who had been standing at the window for some considerable time in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, remarked without turning his head that we should have a visitor within the quarter hour. I had learned, over the years, not to demand the reasoning behind such pronouncements. Experience had taught me that the explanation, when it came, would be both simple and mortifying to my own powers of observation. I set down the paper and waited. The bell sounded at 20 minutes past 9, and Mrs. Hudson presently admitted a man of perhaps 55 years, heavily built, with the close-clipped side whiskers then fashionable among city merchants, and the ruddy complexion of one accustomed to comfortable dining. He wore a black frock coat of excellent cut, though I noticed the left sleeve had been brushed with unusual vigour, as though an attempt had been made to restore it to a freshness it no longer quite possessed. He carried his hat in both hands and turned it slowly as he spoke, a gesture which in my medical experience I have always associated with suppressed agitation rather than habitual nervousness. "Mr. Holmes," said he, accepting the chair which Holmes indicated with a languid hand, "I am told you are a man who can be trusted with delicate matters." "I am told so myself upon occasion," said Holmes, dropping into his armchair and pressing his fingertips together in that familiar attitude of patient attention. "Pray continue." The visitor introduced himself as Percival Lethbridge, senior partner and sole remaining principal of the firm of Lethbridge and Company, textile importers, of Lombard Street. The name was not unknown to me. In better days I had seen it mentioned in the financial columns of the Times as among the steadier houses in the trade, a firm with 30 years of history behind it and a reputation for the sober management that distinguishes commerce from speculation. Those better days, it emerged, had concluded with some abruptness. Lethbridge unfolded his account with the measured deliberation of a man who has rehearsed it, though not so thoroughly as to drain it of apparent feeling. The firm, he explained, had suffered a catastrophic collapse in the preceding 3 weeks. Creditors had been left exposed to the sum of some £40,000. Investors who had placed funds with the company on the faith of its reputation had found themselves without recourse. He himself, he said, with a slow shake of his heavy head, had been reduced very nearly to penury. "A painful reversal," said Holmes, his eyes half closed. "But I confess I'm not yet clear, Mr. Lethbridge, in what capacity you require my assistance. Bankruptcy, however unhappy, is not ordinarily a matter for Baker Street." Lethbridge leaned forward. "It is not the failure itself which brings me here, Mr. Holmes. It is what preceded it. Someone filed confidential bankruptcy documents in my firm's name some weeks before the public collapse. Documents which I never authorised, never signed, and of which I had no knowledge until my solicitor brought them to my attention. Those documents circulated quietly through certain channels, caused panic among my creditors, and permitted at least one substantial investor to withdraw funds before the general disaster became known. My reputation, Mr. Holmes, which I spent 30 years constructing, has been reduced to rubble, and the man most immediately responsible walks free. Holmes opened his eyes fully at that. And who, in the general opinion, is that man? Harold Fenwick, my junior accountant. He was arrested yesterday evening at Charing Cross Station with a bag of ledgers and a sum in excess of £300 in notes. I confess that upon hearing these particulars my own judgment moved with some swiftness toward an unfavourable conclusion regarding this Fenwick. Holmes, however, gave no outward sign of forming any conclusion whatsoever. He asked Lethbridge to describe, as precisely as he could recall, the sequence of events leading from the first rumour of financial difficulty to the moment of public collapse. Lethbridge obliged, speaking for some 20 minutes with the fluency of a man who had already given the same account to the police. The story, stripped to its essentials, was this. In the third week of September, certain creditors had begun pressing for early settlement on outstanding balances, claiming they had received word that Lethbridge and Company was insolvent. Lethbridge had been bewildered, since the firm's position, while not robust, was not in his understanding critical. His solicitor had then discovered that a formal bankruptcy petition, bearing the firm's identifying details, had been lodged with the appropriate authorities weeks earlier, though Lethbridge himself had never instructed any such filing. Suspicion had fallen almost immediately upon Fenwick, whose behaviour in the days surrounding these events had been, by all accounts, conspicuous. He had burned papers in the office fireplace. He had been observed entering the premises on at least one occasion after the ordinary hours of business. A duplicate key to the strong-box in which certain filing drafts were stored had been found in his possession. And now came the arrest at Charing Cross, with the ledgers and the banknotes, which had apparently struck Inspector Lestrade as altogether conclusive. It was at the mention of Lestrade's name that I first noticed something in Holmes's expression. A fractional narrowing of the eyes, perhaps, or a slight tension about the mouth. It was gone in an instant, and I might have imagined it entirely. "Inspector Lestrade considers the matter settled?" Holmes asked. "He was good enough to inform me this morning that he expects to put Fenwick before the magistrate within the week," said Lethbridge. "But I confess, Mr. Holmes, that I am not entirely satisfied. There are questions which the inspector has not, to my mind, adequately addressed. I should like your independent judgment." Holmes rose abruptly from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to us both, apparently examining the photograph of a Swiss waterfall which had occupied the same position there for as long as I could remember. "What questions, Mr. Lethbridge?" "In truth, I cannot articulate them clearly," said our visitor, with what seemed to me genuine discomfort. "It is more a feeling than a reasoned objection. I know Fenwick to be a weak man, Mr. Holmes. I never rated his intelligence highly. It seems to me that whoever arranged this scheme did so with considerable precision." There followed a brief silence. I watched Holmes at the mantelpiece and found his stillness more difficult to read than another man's agitation. "I shall look into the matter," said Holmes at last, turning with the decisive air I knew well. "Watson, if you are at liberty, I should value your company tomorrow morning. We shall visit the offices of Lethbridge and Company." Lethbridge departed with expressions of gratitude which Holmes received with the polite distraction he invariably showed when his mind was already occupied elsewhere. When our visitor had gone, I expected Holmes to offer some remark upon the affair. Instead, he retrieved his violin from its case, drew the bow experimentally across the strings, and said nothing whatsoever for the remainder of the morning. I didn't press him, but I noted with the interest of a long acquaintance that he played not the sharp, precise passages he favoured when stimulated by a problem nearly resolved, but a slower, more searching melody, the kind he produced when something had struck him as not quite what it appeared. That evening I opened my notebook and wrote at the top of a fresh page the words, "Lethbridge and Company." Then I sat for some time, uncertain what to record beneath them, for nothing seemed as yet certain enough to commit to paper. It was, I think, an appropriate beginning. Chapter 2. The clerk who ran the offices of Lethbridge and Company occupied the upper 2 floors of a narrow building in Lombard Street, wedged between a bill-broker's premises and the blank stone facade of a minor insurance house. I had passed the street many times in my years as a London resident without occasion to remark upon it, and I confess that even now, approaching it with Holmes at my side on a raw October morning, it presented nothing to the eye that distinguished it from 100 similar addresses. Commerce, in its workaday forms, does not generally announce itself with architectural drama. It was only when we had climbed the inner stair and the clerk admitted us to the principal rooms that one felt, unmistakably, the particular quality of silence that inhabits a place of business abruptly brought to nothing. Desks stood exactly as their occupants had left them. A pen lay diagonally across an open ledger, as though set down for a moment rather than abandoned. The large wall calendar, of the kind printed for commercial use with broad margins for notation, still displayed the 3rd week of September. Someone had drawn a line through several consecutive days and written beside them a notation I could not read from the doorway. Holmes moved through the rooms with the unhurried attention I had observed in him at dozens of similar scenes. He did not rush to the desk or the strong-box. He stood first in the centre of the outer office and looked slowly about him, the way a man entering a gallery looks before he determines which painting he will study. Then he crossed to the window and examined the view into the street below for a moment before turning his attention inward. Inspector Lestrade met us in the inner office. He was in good humour, which in my experience of the man generally indicated that a case had resolved itself to his satisfaction. "Mr. Holmes," said he, with the slightly proprietary manner of a man showing off property he has already secured. "I had wondered whether we might expect you. Good morning, Doctor. I warn you, there is very little here to puzzle a first-rate mind. The business is as plain as a pikestaff." "Then you will have no objection to my confirming the plainness for myself," said Holmes pleasantly, and moved past the inspector toward the row of shelves along the far wall, before Lestrade could frame a response. The case against Harold Fenwick was, as Lestrade described it to me while Holmes worked in silence, formidably constructed. Fenwick had altered bookkeeping entries on at least 4 occasions across the preceding 2 months, adjusting figures in ways which, taken together, obscured the true movement of certain funds. His signature appeared upon correspondence connected to the concealed bankruptcy petition, specifically a covering letter addressed to the court's administrative office. 2 members of staff recalled seeing him enter the building on the evening of the 15th of September, which was to say 3 evenings before the petition was formally submitted, and an inquiry into his personal affairs had revealed gambling debts amounting to some £60, owed to a credit establishment in Soho of less than reputable character. At Charing Cross, when apprehended, he had been carrying 3 firm ledgers in a travelling bag alongside £320 in mixed denomination notes, which he could not satisfactorily account for. Add to that the fact that he burned a quantity of correspondence in his own fireplace the evening before his attempted departure, Lestrade concluded, with the satisfaction of a man reading the final entry in a balanced account, and I think you have your man beyond any reasonable doubt. A persuasive inventory, I agreed. Holmes said nothing. He had stopped before the shelving and was examining not the books themselves but the empty spaces between them, running one finger along a bare section of shelf in a motion so slight that Lestrade did not appear to notice it. "There is something else," said Lestrade, lowering his voice with the air of one disclosing a final card. "Fenwick himself cannot explain his actions. He claims innocence, but when pressed as to why he was leaving London with firm ledgers and an unexplained sum, he becomes incoherent. He says the money was given to him for safekeeping by a party he refuses to name." "Does he?" said Holmes, without turning. "How very inconvenient for him." There was nothing in the tone to indicate whether Holmes regarded the inconvenience as Fenwick's bad luck or as a detail deserving of examination. He completed his survey of the shelves and moved next to the central desk, where he bent low over the surface, examining it from an almost horizontal angle, as one might study a painting for the texture of the brushwork rather than the image. What he found there, or whether he found anything, he did not say. He gave equally close attention to the arrangement of the inkstands. There were two, a larger pot of standard commercial black and a smaller subsidiary vessel, which appeared to contain a different preparation, darker and slightly more viscous in character, of the sort sometimes used for formal correspondence requiring a more imposing appearance on the page. Holmes uncapped this second vessel, held it briefly to the light from the window and replaced it without comment. Finally, he asked Lestrade whether he might see the copy of the bankruptcy petition which had been filed. Lestrade produced it from a leather case with the promptness of a man who had been expecting the request. Holmes read it standing, taking considerably longer over it than its length seemed to require. Twice he returned to passages he had already passed, and once he drew his forefinger very slowly beneath a line of text, as though measuring the distance between words. "Thank you," he said at last, returning the document. "One question, Lestrade. At what hour was the petition formally received by the court?" "The official time of receipt is recorded as 8:47 in the evening, and Fenwick was observed leaving the building. The night watchman at the adjacent premises saw him depart at approximately 8 o'clock, perhaps a few minutes after." Holmes nodded once, slowly, in the manner of a man who finds a thing precisely where he expected it. He said nothing further on the subject, but turned to examine the fireplace in the corner of the room, where the remains of burned paper had been left undisturbed in the grate. He crouched before it and studied the ash with attention. The fragments were thorough. Whoever had fed the fire had done so with method. He did not touch them. As we descended the stairs and emerged once more into the noise and cold of Lombard Street, I asked Holmes what conclusions he had formed. He drew his coat collar up against the wind before replying. "I have formed several observations which are not yet conclusions, Watson. A conclusion requires a foundation which the evidence here does not yet provide, however determinedly Lestrade believes otherwise. But Fenwick's guilt seems—" "The evidence proves access," said Holmes, cutting across me with a precision that was not unkind. "Every item Lestrade cited tells us that Fenwick was present, that he handled documents, that he entered the building, that he possessed a key. All of it establishes that he could have filed that petition. Not one item establishes that he did." I turned this over as we walked. "You believe him innocent, then?" Holmes was silent for a moment, watching a hansom navigate the press of vehicles at the Lombard Street junction. "I believe," he said finally, "that someone has worked very hard to ensure I should not need to ask that question, which is, in my experience, a far more interesting circumstance than mere guilt." He hailed a cab and gave the driver an address in Chancery Lane. I followed him in, questions assembling themselves in my mind faster than I could order them, and found that by the time the cab had turned into King William Street, Holmes had already closed his eyes, his chin sunk upon his chest, in the attitude of deep reflection which I had long since learned to leave undisturbed. Outside, London went about the ordinary business of its morning, indifferent as ever to the quiet questions being posed within our cab. I watched the streets pass and said nothing, and found myself, for the first time since Lethbridge had sat in our Baker Street armchair, not entirely certain what I thought. Chapter 3. The Assumption of Ruin. Chancery Lane in October has a character entirely its own. The legal profession concentrates itself along that narrow corridor of London, with a density which lends the whole street the atmosphere of a building rather than a thoroughfare, hushed, purposeful, faintly oppressive to the uninitiated. Clerks move between chambers with the brisk certainty of men who know precisely which paragraph of which statute governs their errand. One feels, walking among them, that London here regards itself rather more seriously than it does elsewhere. Holmes moved through it without appearing to notice his surroundings at all. His mind, I had come to understand over the years, occupied itself with interior architecture during those intervals when his body was merely in transit, and he was capable of arriving at a destination having observed, in any conventional sense, nothing of the route. I had ceased to find this remarkable. What I had not ceased to find remarkable was the precision with which his interior calculations tended to resolve themselves into exterior results. The Court of Chancery archive rooms occupied a ground-floor office of considerable age and indifferent ventilation. The clerk who received us was a spare, sandy-haired individual of the methodical type, which such institutions invariably attract and retain, and he regarded Holmes's card with the cautious respect of a man who has heard a name before, but is uncertain in precisely what context. Holmes explained that he wished to examine prior filings associated with the firm of Lethbridge and Company, specifically any petitions, voluntary arrangements, or formal notices of financial difficulty submitted during the preceding 7 years. The clerk consulted his register, disappeared behind a partition, and returned after some minutes with a modest collection of folders which he arranged upon the counter with the precise alignment of a man who takes orders seriously. I occupied myself with a survey of the room while Holmes worked. It was not a place designed for comfort. A long table of scarred oak, several ladder-back chairs, a window admitting light of the grey and qualified variety common to London in autumn. On the wall opposite hung a framed notice in small print which I took for some procedural regulation, and did not trouble to read. Holmes, meanwhile, moved through the documents with the focused economy of a man who knows what he is looking for, and is quietly disappointed to find something else instead. He called me over after perhaps 20 minutes. "Look at this," said he, setting 2 folders side by side and opening each to a specific page. I examined the documents. They appeared to be formal notices of financial arrangement, the first dated some 6 years previously, the second approximately 3 years after that. Both concerned Lethbridge and Company. Both recorded in the flat language of legal administration that the firm had negotiated revised terms with creditors following a declaration of reduced trading capacity. "The firm has been in difficulty before," I observed. "The firm has declared itself to be in difficulty before," Holmes corrected, with a precision that at the time seemed merely pedantic. "These 2 filings record losses which, according to the statements attached, were sufficient to justify considerable concessions from creditors, reduced settlement terms, extended repayment periods, relief from certain contractual obligations." He tapped the relevant passage in the second document. "And on both occasions, Watson, the firm recovered with remarkable promptness. Within 18 months of each filing, Lethbridge and Company was trading at or above its previous volume." "A fortunate recovery," I said. "Fortuitous recoveries are not impossible," said Holmes, closing both folders with a neat precision that implied he had transferred their contents entirely to his own memory. "But they invite a question, which I find nobody has yet troubled to pose. When a firm declares loss, negotiates relief from its obligations on the strength of that declaration, and then proceeds to recover its position with speed and completeness, one is entitled to ask whether the loss was of the same order as the declaration. I considered this. You're suggesting Lethbridge exaggerated his losses. I am suggesting that the pattern is consistent with exaggeration, and inconsistent with the sort of genuine financial distress which leaves permanent damage. Whether it is proof of anything, I cannot yet say, but it illuminates a habit of mind which I find instructive when considered alongside the present affair." We returned the folders to the sandy-haired clerk and thanked him. Holmes paused at the door to the street and stood for a moment with his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets, looking at nothing in particular, with the focused inattention that I associated with a mind rearranging its furniture. The afternoon brought fresh intelligence, delivered in the form of a note from Lestrade which awaited us on our return to Baker Street. It had been written with the satisfied brevity of a man tying a final knot. Forensic examination of the bankruptcy petition had identified Fenwick's fingerprints upon the sealing wax used to close the original envelope in which the document had been submitted to the court. Furthermore, a messenger employed by a legal stationers near Temple Bar recalled delivering a packet of formal court forms to the offices of Lethbridge and Company some 6 weeks prior, and had specifically identified Fenwick as the individual who had received them at the door. I read the note aloud and looked to Holmes for his reaction. He was standing at the mantelpiece, filling his pipe with the deliberate attention he gave to small physical tasks when his mind was occupied with larger ones. "Lestrade is thorough," he said, without inflection. "The fingerprints on the sealing wax are rather difficult to dismiss," I ventured. "They are difficult to dismiss as evidence of contact," said Holmes. "They say nothing, of themselves, about the occasion of that contact, or the purpose behind it. A man may seal a letter for any number of reasons other than the authorship of its contents." He lit his pipe and exhaled slowly. "However, I will concede that the accumulation is becoming impressive. Impressive enough, in fact, to prompt a question which I cannot yet answer." "What question is that?" He turned from the mantelpiece and looked at me directly, with the slightly unsettling steadiness he brought to moments he considered important. "Why file a bankruptcy petition in secret at all, Watson? Follow the logic with me for a moment. Lethbridge and Company is in difficulty. Ruin, let us say, is inevitable. The ordinary motive for concealing a bankruptcy filing in advance of the public declaration is to permit certain parties to withdraw their interest before the general collapse destroys the value of those interests. That is what Lestrade believes occurred. But consider, if ruin is already inevitable, what advantage accrues to the architect of the concealment? He does not save the firm. He does not alter the final outcome. He merely reshuffles, at considerable personal risk, who bears the loss and who escapes it." "A motive of personal profit at others' expense," I said, "which fits Fenwick well enough, if he was bribed by investors to provide early warning." "It fits anyone with access to the information," said Holmes. "Fenwick, yes, but also Lethbridge himself, his solicitor, his private secretary, any person within the firm's inner circle." He paused. "But here is what troubles me, Watson, and what I cannot yet explain. If the concealment existed to protect investors from the consequences of inevitable ruin, then ruin must have been inevitable. Was it?" He left the question suspended in the air between us, and said nothing further that evening. I sat with it through dinner, through the subsequent hours of reading, and into the early part of the night, and I could not satisfactorily answer it. It seemed to me at the time to be a philosophical refinement, the sort of question Holmes produced when he was enjoying a problem for its own sake. I did not then perceive that it was, in fact, the most important question in the entire affair. That understanding would come later, and at considerable cost to my certainty in other matters. For the present I noted the question in my records, marked it with a line of emphasis, and underscored it a second time when I read it back. Then I closed my notebook and went to bed, leaving Holmes still at the mantelpiece, the pipe going slowly, his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a man reading a text that no one else in the room can see. Chapter 4. The Language of Failure. There are moments in an investigation when the available evidence appears so thoroughly to confirm a single conclusion that continued doubt begins to resemble not rigour but obstinacy. I had reached such a moment by the morning following our visit to Chancery Lane, and I am not ashamed to record it, since I believe it illustrates precisely the kind of intellectual trap which Holmes spent his career dismantling, and into which the rest of us fall with a regularity that ought to be humbling. He, by contrast, appeared to have slept well, and was in a state of alert good humour when I came down to breakfast. The table had been pushed aside to accommodate several sheets of foolscap, upon which he had been writing in his small precise hand since some early hour, and Mrs. Hudson had left his egg in a condition of resigned overcooking beside a rack of cold toast. Holmes ate neither, but was nursing a cup of tea and reading from a document which I recognised, as I drew closer, as a duplicate copy of the bankruptcy petition obtained through Lestrade. "Good morning, Watson," said he without looking up. "I have been studying our document. Sit down. There are one or two points which I should value a second opinion upon, though I use the term loosely, since what I chiefly require is someone to whom I may speak aloud." I accepted this characterization with the equanimity long practice had given me, poured my own tea, and sat. Holmes set the petition flat upon the table and smoothed it with the edge of his hand. "Read the second paragraph of the third section," he said. not for its content, for its construction. I found the passage and read it through twice. It concerned the formal enumeration of outstanding obligations and employed, as such documents do, a vocabulary more comfortable in legal chambers than in ordinary conversation. I said as much. He noticed nothing particular about its phrasing. I read it a third time. It seems to me rather formal, I said. More elaborate than necessary, perhaps, for what is essentially a list of creditors. More elaborate, yes, and more specific in its elaborations than English commercial law generally requires. Holmes drew his forefinger beneath two phrases in the second sentence. These terms, Watson, they are not wrong. They are not even unusual in themselves. But in English bankruptcy proceedings they are unnecessary. The information they convey is conveyed more simply and more commonly by expressions which any London solicitor would employ as a matter of course. He paused. I have this morning been consulting Blackwood's commentary on insolvency practice, which I keep for such occasions, and I find that this precise formulation, this particular doubling of specification where a single term would suffice, is characteristic not of English commercial procedure but of the Scottish system. I looked at the phrases again. You believe the petition was drafted by someone familiar with Scottish insolvency law? I believe it was drafted by someone whose instinct, when reaching for formal legal language, reached for a Scottish model rather than an English one. Whether from education, from prior professional experience, or from some document used as a template, I cannot yet determine. He leaned back and took a sip of his cold tea without apparent dissatisfaction. But Harold Fenwick, by every account we have been given, has spent the whole of his adult life within London. He was born in Bermondsey. He was schooled in Suffolk. He has never, to anyone's knowledge, lived or worked beyond the boundaries of this city. The implication was plain enough, and I felt the first genuine loosening of my conviction regarding Fenwick's guilt. Then whoever drafted the petition was not Fenwick, I said. Or was not Fenwick acting alone and unguided, Holmes replied, which was a distinction I recognised as characteristically precise. I do not yet wish to say more than the evidence licenses. It was that afternoon that we called upon Mr. Julian Croxley, the solicitor whose name appeared upon the petition's accompanying correspondence as the practitioner through whose offices certain communications had been routed. His chambers were in Gray's Inn, 2 rooms of moderate size furnished with the practical rather than the decorative, and he received us with a wariness which he made some effort to disguise beneath professional courtesy. Croxley was a man of perhaps 40, lean in the manner of those who carry tension in their frame rather than depositing it as flesh, with quick dark eyes, and a mouth that moved with care, as though each word was considered before release. He had, he told us, already spoken with Inspector Lestrade on 2 occasions, and I noticed that he offered this information early in our conversation, in the manner of a man establishing that his account is already on record and therefore consistent. His version of events was straightforward. He had been approached by Fenwick, he said, who had requested his professional assistance in preparing certain documents relating to the firm's affairs. Fenwick had been insistent upon secrecy, and had represented himself as acting upon the instructions of a senior member of the firm. Croxley had complied, he admitted, without making inquiries as thorough as he ought perhaps to have made, a failing he ascribed to pressure of other business and Fenwick's assurances. Holmes listened to this account without interruption and without visible reaction, which I had learned to recognise as a form of concentrated attention more intense than his more demonstrative modes. When Croxley finished, Holmes was silent for a moment, then asked him to describe the first conversation with Fenwick in detail. What followed was remarkable not so much for what Croxley said as for the texture of how he said it. He recalled the date with certainty, the time of day with precision, the exact table in the coffee-house where the meeting occurred, the coat Fenwick was wearing, the specific sequence of sentences by which Fenwick had introduced the matter. It was a performance of memory so complete and particular that it produced in me, paradoxically, a faint unease rather than the confidence such specificity might be expected to inspire. I have sat with enough witnesses in my time to know that genuine recollection is almost never so uniformly detailed. It has gaps, qualifications, moments where the speaker pauses and corrects himself. Croxley paused for nothing. He also, I noticed, described Fenwick's demeanour in terms strikingly vivid. The restlessness of the man's hands, the shifting of his eyes, the lowered voice carrying what Croxley called an unmistakable urgency. It was a portrait rather than a recollection. Holmes thanked him politely and we took our leave. On the pavement outside I shared my impression. "You noticed it too," said Holmes with a brief sideways glance. "His memory was almost theatrical in its completeness," I said. "And yet," said Holmes, "he could tell me nothing of the colour of the coffee-house curtains, whether it was raining that morning, or what he himself had ordered to drink. The peripheral details, which a genuinely remembering man retains at random, were entirely absent. Only the details bearing upon Fenwick were sharp." He tucked his chin briefly into his collar as we walked. "When a man remembers too perfectly, Watson, he generally remembers what he has rehearsed." The observation was delivered quietly, without emphasis, in the tone he used for things he considered settled. I did not immediately grasp its full weight, attending as I was to the physical effort of keeping pace with his long stride on the wet pavement. It was only later, in the cab returning to Baker Street, that I turned the remark over completely and understood it. Croxley's account was not the account of a man who had lived through events and was now recalling them. It was the account of a man who had prepared an account and was now delivering it. That was one thing. What it implied about who had done the preparing was another matter entirely, and one which I did not yet feel equipped to resolve. Holmes, beside me in the cab, had produced a small notebook and was writing in it in the cramped shorthand he used for working notes. I did not ask to see it. The rain had begun in earnest by the time we turned into Baker Street, and Luston outside the cab window had become a succession of dark shapes and blurred reflections, all surface and no depth, the way things look when one is not yet certain how to see them properly. Chapter 5. The Widow Investor. The name of Mrs. Agnes Barlow had appeared in Lestrade's notes as a peripheral figure, one of several investors whose withdrawal of funds in the days before the public collapse had contributed to the creditors' panic. Lestrade had interviewed her briefly and found her account consistent with his existing theory. She had received warning, she had acted upon it, and the warning had come, in his estimation, from Fenwick. Holmes had said nothing when I relayed this summary to him, which I had come to recognise as a form of comment in itself. We called upon her on the Thursday morning at the address in Kensington which Lestrade's note supplied. It was a well-maintained terrace house, of the sort inhabited by those whose income, while not spectacular, has been reliably maintained over decades. The curtains were good quality, and recently cleaned. The brass on the door was polished to a degree that spoke of a household run on fixed principles. Mrs. Barlow herself, who received us in a sitting-room furnished with the restrained comfort of late middle age, was a composed woman of perhaps 60, white-haired, upright in her chair, with the alert stillness of one accustomed to conducting her own affairs without assistance. She offered us tea, which Holmes declined with a courtesy that somehow contrived to be absolute without being abrupt, and she settled her hands in her lap with the deliberate composure of a person who has decided in advance to be cooperative. "I have already given my account to the police," she said, addressing Holmes with the directness of one who prefers to establish the terrain before proceeding across it. "I shall be glad to repeat it, if it is of service." "I am grateful," said Holmes, "though it is perhaps less the account itself than one or two points of detail, which I should like to explore if you will permit me." She inclined her head. She had invested in Lethbridge and Company, she explained, some 4 years previously, on the recommendation of a business acquaintance whose judgment she had found reliable in other matters. The investment had performed adequately, generating returns neither remarkable nor disappointing, and she had given it little active attention in the intervening period. Then, in the second week of September, she had received the first of 2 anonymous letters. Holmes asked to see them. She produced both from a small writing desk with a promptness suggesting she had anticipated the request. They were typed, on plain paper of the common commercial variety, unsigned. The first stated that the firm of Lethbridge and Company was in serious financial difficulty and that investors would be well advised to review their positions. The second, arriving 3 days later, was more explicit. It described the existence of a concealed bankruptcy petition and urged immediate withdrawal. Holmes held each letter to the window light in turn. He examined the typeface, the weight and texture of the paper, the precise placement of the text upon the page. He turned the second letter over and examined its blank reverse with equal attention. Then he set both on the side table and folded his hands. "You acted upon these warnings," he said. "I'm not by nature a speculative person," said Mrs. Barlow. "When I receive a warning of sufficient specificity, I regard it seriously. I contacted my solicitor and we arranged withdrawal of the principal within the week." "Quite so." Holmes paused. The pause had the quality of a breath drawn before a particular question, and I found myself attending to it. "Mrs. Barlow, forgive me if this seems an odd line of inquiry, but I wonder whether you might describe for me what you understood, at the time of my colleague Inspector Lestrade's visit, about the identity of the person suspected of leaking this information." She met this without visible discomfort. The inspector indicated that a junior employee of the firm was suspected, an accountant, I believe. "And did he give you a name?" "He mentioned a Mr. Fenwick." Holmes nodded with the expression of a man confirming something already suspected. "I ask," he said, "because I am curious to understand the sequence in which you learned certain things. You received the letters in September. Lestrade visited you, I believe, on the 22nd of October. Our own conversation is today, the 27th. He let a brief silence develop. "I raise this only because you have twice now, in the course of our conversation, referred to the person who sent the warning letters in terms which assume his identity to be known." I had not noticed this. I looked at Mrs. Barlow and saw, for the first time, a faint adjustment in her composure, the equivalent in a controlled person of what in a less disciplined one might have been a visible start. "I do not believe I have done so," she said, with careful evenness. "You describe the sender's purpose as establishing a means of financial rescue for certain investors," said Holmes. "You used the pronoun he on 3 occasions before the name Fenwick was introduced into our conversation, and when I mentioned this investigation at the outset, you said immediately that his behaviour had struck you as agitated. I had not yet told you the suspect was male, nor had I described any behaviour." There was a silence of some seconds. Outside, a cart horse passed in the street and the window glass vibrated faintly. "I may have made assumptions," said Mrs. Barlow with precision. "You may," said Holmes pleasantly. "Most of us do. The question which interests me is the source of yours." He did not press her further on that point, which I understood as deliberate. Instead, he returned to the letters, asking about the envelopes in which they had arrived, the times of their delivery, whether she had shown them to anyone before Lestrade's visit. She answered each question with the conscientious care of a person navigating ground she had not fully surveyed in advance, and the slight effortfulness of it was itself, I thought, informative. When we left, the morning had advanced toward noon, and the Kensington streets were tolerably busy. Holmes walked for a full minute without speaking, his hands clasped behind him, his stride set, at the measured pace he adopted when assembling rather than pursuing. "She knew," I said. "She knew rather more than she received by post," Holmes agreed. "What specifically she knew, and from whom, I cannot yet demonstrate. But her characterization of the sender preceded any reasonable opportunity to have formed it, and that kind of anticipation does not arise from anonymous correspondence." He paused at the corner and looked briefly up the street as though reading something written in the middle distance. "Prepared testimony, Watson, is among the most dangerous forms of falsehood, not because it is bold, but because it is careful. It has had time to remove from itself everything that might give it away. What it cannot remove is the assumptions it has quietly smuggled in, the things the speaker knows without yet having been told. I turned this over as we walked toward the main road in search of a cab. The letters themselves had seemed to me on examination entirely unremarkable as physical objects, but I had observed Holmes's attention to them and knew better than to accept their unremarkability at face value. "The letters," I said. "You found something." "The letters told me several things," said Holmes, raising his hand to a passing hansom. "The typeface is of a variety common to commercial office machines, manufactured in the early part of the decade. The paper is cut slightly narrower than the standard commercial quire, by a margin small enough to go unnoticed on casual inspection, but consistent enough to suggest it was trimmed deliberately. And the second letter was composed on a different machine than the first." The cab drew up. Holmes handed me in and gave the driver Baker Street before settling back against the cushion. "2 machines," I said. "2 authors, or 1 author, in 2 different locations, which amounts to nearly the same thing for our present purposes." He looked out of the window at the passing street. Someone was careful. Someone composed the letters in more than one place to prevent the tracing of a single typewriter. Someone understood that letters would be examined. He turned back from the window. "Fenwick, as I have now established to my own satisfaction, has never in his life owned or regularly operated a typewriting machine. The office at Lombard Street possessed one, certainly. But the office machine was examined by Lestrade and does not match either of the typefaces in those letters." He said nothing further. I watched his profile against the grey light of the cab window, and thought about careful people, and about the particular quality of Mrs. Barlow's composure, so thorough and so studied, and about the word "he" introduced into her account 3 questions before its moment, like a note played just slightly ahead of the bar. The cab turned south, and Baker Street received us, and Holmes went directly to his chemistry table without removing his coat, which told me that whatever he had gathered that morning had presented him with a compound he now wished to analyse. I sat down, opened my notebook, and wrote the word anticipation at the top of a fresh page. Then I underlined it, twice, as I had done with Holmes's question 3 nights before. The habit, it seemed, was becoming useful. Chapter 6. A Matter of Timing. It is a feature of Holmes's method that he will sometimes, having gathered a quantity of observations, retreat entirely from the active pursuit of new ones, and spend a period of hours or days in the rearrangement of what he already possesses. During such intervals he becomes poor company in the conventional sense. He eats irregularly, sleeps at unpredictable hours, and is liable to produce remarks which are either entirely without context, or so far advanced of the conversation as to have no visible connection to anything that preceded them. I had learned, across the years of our association, to regard these periods not as vacancy, but as concentration of a kind I was not equipped to follow, and to occupy myself with my own affairs until he surfaced. He surfaced on the Friday evening with a sheet of foolscap covered in columns of times, names, and brief notations in his compressed hand. He spread it on the table between our chairs without preamble and sat back. "The timeline," he said simply. I examined it. He had reconstructed the movements of every relevant party on the evening of the 15th of September, the night on which the bankruptcy petition had been submitted for filing. He had worked from the watchman's testimony, from Lestrade's notes, from the court's official receipt stamp, and from several sources whose provenance he did not immediately explain but which I took, from their precision, to include some private inquiry of his own. The picture it presented was this. Fenwick had arrived at the Lombard Street offices at approximately 7:30 in the evening. The night watchman at the adjacent premises, whose testimony Lestrade had recorded, had observed him entering. Fenwick had remained inside for a period of roughly 30 minutes, and had departed, the same watchman confirmed, at approximately 8 o'clock, perhaps a few minutes after. These facts were not in dispute. The bankruptcy petition, however, bore the court's official stamp of receipt at 8:47. I'd noted this discrepancy when Holmes first mentioned it after our visit to Lombard Street, and had since carried it at the back of my mind without fully drawing it out for examination. Now, spread in Holmes's careful columns, it presented itself with a clarity that made my previous inattention seem almost willful. Fenwick left nearly 50 minutes before the petition was received, I said. 47 minutes, Holmes said. The court offices in question are 12 minutes from Lombard Street by cab under ordinary evening conditions. I have verified this myself on 2 occasions this week at comparable hours. On foot the journey requires somewhat longer, but is still achievable in under 25 minutes for a man of ordinary pace. Then Fenwick could still have filed it after leaving, I said. He had time. He had time, Holmes agreed. What he did not have, according to the evidence as it stands, is the petition itself. The document was found in the office strongbox by Lestrade's men who searched the premises the following morning. The original draft with handwritten emendations was still there, inside the box, which was found locked. He let this settle. Fenwick held a duplicate key, but if he had taken the petition with him when he departed at 8 o'clock, it could not have been found inside the locked strongbox the following morning. I worked through this carefully. Unless he returned and replaced it. Unless he returned, filed a copy rather than the draft, and returned the draft to the box before locking it again. Holmes inclined his head. Which is possible. I do not dismiss it. But it requires a sequence of actions in a 50-minute window that grows considerably more elaborate with each step. He tapped the foolscap. And it introduces a further question. 3 people, by Lestrade's own reckoning, retained access to those offices after Fenwick's departure. Lethbridge himself, Croxley, who held a professional copy of certain chamber keys in his capacity as a retained solicitor, and Miss Eleanor Vane, Lethbridge's private secretary, who as a matter of established routine held a key to permit early morning access when her employer was travelling. I had not previously attended closely to the figure of Miss Vane, who had appeared in Lestrade's notes as a cooperative witness supplying details consistent with Fenwick's guilt. I said as much. She has been cooperative to a remarkable degree, said Holmes. I have read Lestrade's transcript of his interview with her with some care. She confirms every material fact that damages Fenwick, his late arrivals, his agitation in the days preceding the collapse, his handling of certain correspondence. Her memory in all these particulars is precise. He paused. But there is something in her language which I have been examining. Lestrade's notes record her directly at several points. She uses, in 3 separate answers, legal expressions which are not consistent with the vocabulary one would expect of a private secretary, however capable. Such as? Holmes named 2 phrases, neither of which I shall reproduce here as they were sufficiently technical to be unhelpful to the general reader, and explained that both belonged to the same specialised register of insolvency terminology he had identified in the petition itself. The same register, he observed quietly, that was more natural to Scottish legal practice than to English. I sat with this for a moment. Miss Vane, I said. Miss Vane, Holmes confirmed, with the neutrality of a man who has arrived at a destination and is not yet prepared to announce it. He had made discreet inquiries regarding her background, he told me, through channels he did not specify. She was a woman of about 35, the daughter of an Edinburgh advocate who had trained in the administrative offices of a Scottish legal chamber before moving south some 8 years previously. She had come to Lethbridge's employment through a professional introduction and had been with the firm for 6 years. Edinburgh. I looked at Holmes. He received the look with the same careful neutrality. You believe she drafted the petition, I said. I believe she possessed both the linguistic instinct and the professional knowledge to have done so, said Holmes. Whether she acted on her own initiative or under instruction, or in collaboration with another party, I cannot yet say. What I can say is that she has confirmed, with great consistency and considerable legal precision, every element of the case against Fenwick while presenting herself as a merely passive observer. He rose and moved to the window, looking down into Baker Street where the gas lamps had now been lit against the early dark. And I note that in Lestrade's interview she volunteers one piece of information which he had not requested. She mentions, without prompting, that Fenwick had spoken to her on the afternoon of the 15th about the possibility of seeking employment elsewhere. It is the only thing in her account which she introduces without being asked. She wished it to be on record, I said. She wished it to be on record before she was asked, which is a different emphasis. He turned from the window. Voluntary testimony of that precise and convenient kind is not the testimony of a witness, Watson. It is the testimony of an advocate. The question is whose brief she holds. The newspapers had that morning published a further account of the Lethbridge affair, and I had read it over breakfast with the half attention one gives to stories whose private dimensions one knows rather better than the public version. The coverage portrayed Fenwick as a disgraced figure, the scandal as essentially resolved pending formal proceedings, and Lethbridge as a victim of misplaced trust. The tone was not vindictive, but it was settled, and settlement in the public press has a weight of its own that bears upon the innocent and guilty with equally indifferent force. Holmes had not read it, or if he had left no evidence of having done so. He returned to the table and studied his foolscap again, adding 2 small notations in the margin. "I intend to visit the company warehouses tomorrow," he said. "I should be glad of your company." The warehouses? I had not previously understood these to be relevant. Lethbridge cited considerable inventory losses as among the primary causes of the firm's financial distress, said Holmes. "I find I should like to see what remains of that inventory for myself." He folded the foolscap with the care of something he intended to consult again, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "The declared losses of a firm with a history of declaring them have begun to interest me in a way that goes beyond the accounting." He offered nothing further that evening. I sat for a time with my own thoughts, turning over the image of Miss Vane, composed and precise in Lestrade's interview room, volunteering the one detail most useful to the prosecution's case, a woman trained in the offices of a Scottish legal chamber, her father an Edinburgh advocate, and the particular insolvency vocabulary of a legal tradition, not her adopted country's appearing, unbidden, in the folds of a forged petition. The evening advanced and the fire burned down, and Holmes played nothing on his violin that night, which told me, in the private language of our long association, that the problem had passed beyond the phase of searching and into something more purposeful. I was not entirely comfortable with what that purposefulness might find. Chapter 7. The Missing Ledger. The warehouses of Lethbridge and Company occupied a run of railway arches near London Bridge, leased from the South Eastern Railway under an arrangement which, Holmes had discovered through the filing records at Chancery Lane, had been renewed with some regularity across the preceding decade. They were not remarkable premises. The arches along that stretch of the river are the anonymous working organs of the city's commercial body. Low-ceilinged and perpetually damp, smelling of stone and old timber and whatever particular trade has most recently passed through them. 3 of the 5 arches bore Lethbridge's name on painted boards above the iron doors, though the paint was weathered and one board had come partly free of its bracket and hung at an angle that suggested prolonged neglect. Holmes had obtained permission for our visit through a letter from Lestrade, whose authority in such matters remained undisputed despite his satisfaction with the current state of the investigation. A caretaker, a stooped man of considerable age who had worked for the firm in some capacity for many years, admitted us with the resigned cooperation of one accustomed to official visits and indifferent to their purpose. The first arch was empty, not depleted, not partially cleared, but empty in the manner of a space that has been efficiently stripped rather than gradually consumed. The stanchions where shelving had stood still bore the marks of their fittings, and the stone floor retained the rectangular impressions left by heavy storage units that had been removed within the past several months. Holmes walked the length of it in silence, examining the floor, the stanchions, and the walls with equal attention. The second arch contained a quantity of textile goods, bolts of cloth in various states of packaging, crated consignments with shipping labels, accumulated inventory of the kind one would expect of an active import business. Holmes spent less time here, moving through it with the purposeful step of a man confirming an expectation rather than forming one. It was in the third arch that he became still. This space was divided by a timber partition running across its width approximately 2/3 of the way back. a structure that appeared to have been added at some point after the original lease, since the brick on either side of it showed the marks of brackets removed and reset at a different height. Holmes examined this partition for some time, pressing at certain points along its length, studying the gap at the floor, and finally standing back and looking at it with his head slightly inclined. "There is storage space behind this," he said to the caretaker. The old man confirmed it with a nod, expressing neither surprise nor particular interest. "Is it used?" "Not for some months," said the caretaker. "The master moved the goods out over the summer, said he was reorganizing the arrangement. I don't concern myself with the business side." Holmes asked how the space behind the partition was accessed. There was a door at the far end, the caretaker explained. Reached from the service passage outside. Holmes asked to be shown it. The door was padlocked. Holmes studied the padlock with attention for a moment, then produced from his coat pocket the small leather roll of instruments that I had seen him employ on several previous occasions, and which I had long since ceased to inquire about. Within a short time the padlock yielded, and the door swung open. What lay behind the partition was not empty. The space, extending back some 30 feet into the arch, was stacked with crated consignments, organised into rows with a neatness that spoke of professional storage rather than temporary concealment. The crates bore shipping marks and inventory numbers, and the markings, I observed even at a glance, differed from those on the goods in the second arch. These bore the name of a subsidiary company, Hollandale Forwarding, in small stencilled letters along their upper edges. Holmes moved through the rows at a measured pace, reading the stencilled information on each stack and producing his notebook at intervals to copy down particular details. He was at this for perhaps a quarter of an hour, during which I remained near the door and the caretaker stood outside in the service passage, apparently untroubled by the irregularity of the whole proceeding. When Holmes emerged, his expression was one I recognised from other investigations at comparable moments. It was not triumph exactly. It was the particular quality of settled attention that follows the confirmation of a thing one has suspected for some time. "Approximately half the stock listed as lost in the firm's bankruptcy declaration is stored in that room," he said, as we walked back through the arches toward the street, "under the name of a subsidiary company which, if I am not mistaken, has its registered address at a location connected to neither Lethbridge nor his firm in any document I have yet seen." I absorbed this in silence for a moment. "The firm was not ruined at all," I said. "The firm was not ruined at all," Holmes agreed. "Or rather, it was ruined in declaration and intact in fact. The inventory was transferred quietly across the summer months to a subsidiary name, concealing it from creditors and from the bankruptcy assessment. The declared losses were substantially manufactured." He paused at the entrance to the first arch and looked back at the row of iron doors. "The collapse of Lethbridge and Company, Watson, was not a catastrophe which someone sought to conceal. It was a performance which someone staged." We returned to Baker Street in a cab that moved with maddening slowness through the lunchtime press of vehicles. Holmes sat with his notebook open across his knee but wrote nothing further, and I understood that what remained now was not the gathering of evidence but its arrangement into a form that could be demonstrated rather than merely perceived. It was that same afternoon, however, that Lestrade's constable delivered a note announcing a development which threatened to foreclose further inquiry with a finality I found deeply uncomfortable. A ledger had been discovered, not in the offices of Lombard Street but in Fenwick's own lodging house in Bermondsey, concealed behind a false panel in the wall of his rented room. The panel was part of the original Georgian wainscoting, its joint almost invisible to casual inspection, and had been found only because the landlady, searching for the source of a draught, had pressed at a section of the wall and felt it give. The ledger contained what Lestrade's note described as entries clearly recording a series of payments, received at irregular intervals across the preceding year, which appeared to constitute a bribe of some substantial character. The payer was identified only by initials, but the sums corresponded with suggestive precision to transactions traceable through other documents to investors who had withdrawn their funds before the collapse. Lestrade's note concluded with the information that Fenwick, upon being confronted with this evidence, had suffered what his jailer described as a collapse of spirits. He had wept, refused to eat, and had very nearly, in a moment of despair, appended his signature to a prepared confession before his appointed solicitor had intervened. Holmes read the note twice. Then he set it down on the table with the particular deliberateness of a man controlling a reaction. "May I see the ledger?" he said to the constable. It was produced the following morning, brought to Baker Street by a Lestrade who had recovered the brisk confidence that the discovery of the hidden panel had supplied him. Holmes received it at the breakfast table and spent 40 minutes with it, while Lestrade drank tea and made pleasant conversation, at which I responded as adequately as I could manage with my own attention divided. When Holmes set the ledger down, his face was composed. "You have been thorough, Lestrade," he said. "We follow the evidence," said Lestrade with modest satisfaction. "You do," said Holmes, "and so do I. Which is why I find myself obliged to point out that the financial abbreviations employed throughout this ledger belong to shipping insurance practice." He turned the ledger toward Lestrade and indicated the relevant columns with one extended finger. "Not textile accounting. The shorthand here, the notation system, the manner in which offsetting entries are recorded, these are the conventions of the marine insurance trade. A textile accountant, however corrupt, does not develop marine insurance notation through the ordinary course of his work." Lestrade looked at the indicated passages with the expression of a man who has been told that a painting he admired contains a forged signature. "Someone manufactured this evidence," Holmes continued, with a quietness that was more emphatic than volume would have been, using the wrong commercial vocabulary. "The ledger is a fabrication, Lestrade, and a fabrication, in my experience, is always more interesting than the truth it was constructed to replace." Lestrade left with the ledger, and a silence that was, I thought, more productive than his previous certainty. Holmes returned to the window and stood for a long time looking down at Baker Street. I opened my notebook. The page I turned to was the one on which I had written, at the very beginning of the affair, the name of the firm. Beneath it, over the days that had followed, I had accumulated a column of observations and questions. I read them through from the beginning and found, for the first time, that they formed not a list of uncertainties but a shape. I did not yet know whose shape it was, but I was by then considerably less confident it belonged to Harold Fenwick. Chapter 8. Confidence of the Crowd. There is a particular quality to London's appetite for resolution. The city tolerates uncertainty in most things with the pragmatic indifference of a metropolis too large and too busy to attend to every open question. But in matters of public scandal, it becomes impatient with unusual speed, and that impatience, once it has fastened upon a satisfactory explanation, acquires a momentum that is very difficult to oppose with mere evidence. I had observed this before in other cases, and I observed it again now as the second week of the Lethbridge affair gave way to the third. The morning papers had settled comfortably into a narrative. Fenwick was presented across 3 separate accounts I read in as many days, as the archetypal figure of the trusted subordinate corrupted by private vice, his gambling debts providing what journalists find most valuable in such stories, a comprehensible human motive requiring no specialist knowledge to appreciate. Lethbridge himself had given an interview to one of the dailies, conducted with the measured gravity of a man who has suffered but preserved his dignity intact. He expressed sorrow rather than anger at Fenwick's betrayal, spoke of the firm's 30-year reputation as if it were a deceased person for whom he was in mourning, and concluded with a sentiment about the difficulty of knowing who among one's associates may be trusted that the newspaper reproduced in large type beneath his photograph. The photograph showed a heavy, composed man with sad eyes. It was, I reflected, an excellent photograph for his present purposes. Holmes read none of it. Or rather, he read it all in the 10 minutes he habitually gave to the morning papers, then set the whole collection aside and turned to a letter he had received that morning from a firm of inquiry agents in the city, whose services he had engaged 2 days previously, for purposes he had not shared with me. He read the letter standing at the mantelpiece, folded it with precision, and placed it in his breast pocket without comment. "You have found something," I said. "I have had something found for me," he replied, which was a distinction he was punctilious about. The Hollandale Forwarding Company was registered 11 months ago. Its listed directors are two individuals whose names appear in no other commercial record I have been able to locate, a circumstance which in my experience suggests they are nominal rather than actual. Its registered address is a stationer's shop in Aldgate which accepts correspondence on behalf of commercial clients. He turned from the mantelpiece. Its principal financial backer, routed through an intermediary account at a private bank in the city, is a party whose name I am not yet prepared to speak aloud, since I prefer to have rather more than financial records before I do so. I received this with the patience I had cultivated over years of similar moments. "But you know who it is?" "I know who the money points to," said Holmes, which is not quite the same thing, and the distinction matters considerably when the alternative to proof is a false accusation against a man who has already demonstrated a willingness to construct such accusations against others. He moved to the window. "What I require now is not more knowledge but a means of demonstration. The evidence in this case has been layered with deliberate care. The layers pointing toward Fenwick are visible, accessible, and fit together with the neatness of something assembled rather than discovered. The layers pointing elsewhere are real, but require interpretation, and interpretation can be disputed by a competent lawyer in ways that assembled evidence cannot. I thought of Fenwick in his cell, who had very nearly signed a confession, and whose reputation had been publicly ruined before any verdict had been returned. "We are running short of time," I said. "We have sufficient time," said Holmes with the quiet certainty of a man who has already decided how it will be used. That afternoon he visited the company warehouses again, alone. He returned 2 hours later with a rolled document under his arm which proved to be a consignment manifest, copied from the records in the Hollandale storage space, listing the precise contents, valuations, and transfer dates of each crated consignment. He spread it on the table and placed beside it the financial statements which had been submitted as evidence in the bankruptcy declaration, and spent an hour comparing figures from the two documents with the focused deliberation of a scholar resolving a textual discrepancy. The inventory declared lost in the bankruptcy petition, he confirmed at the end of this exercise, had a market value of approximately £16,000. The same inventory, transferred under the Hollandale name and now held in the concealed storage, was valued in its own manifest at £18,200, having appreciated somewhat since its original acquisition. The difference between declared loss and actual concealed value was therefore in excess of £34,000 when combined with the assets which had never been declared at all. "Someone stood to recover a very substantial sum," I said, looking at the figures, "once the creditors had been settled at reduced terms and the company assets were repurchased through the subsidiary at distressed prices." "The mechanism is elegant in principle," said Holmes without admiration. "Declare insolvency, allow creditors to accept fractions of their outstanding claims, retain the actual inventory under a separate name, repurchase whatever shell of the company remains after settlement, emerge from the process solvent in practice while appearing to have been ruined." He set down his pen. The concealed bankruptcy filing served not to hide a collapse, but to create the legal preconditions for one. Without a formally filed petition, the process cannot begin. The filing was the engine of the scheme, not an attempt to obscure it. Outside, the city went about its afternoon. I could hear from the street below the ordinary sounds of commerce and transit, the accumulation of 1,000 unremarkable transactions which constitute the true texture of London life. Somewhere in that texture, Percival Lethbridge was, at this very moment, conducting himself as a respected man of business, wrongly reduced and publicly sympathetic. The newspapers had provided him with a narrative that served him perfectly, and he had furnished them through his interview with the materials to sustain it. Holmes set aside the manifests and moved to his violin, which I had not heard him touch in 3 days. He did not play anything that I recognised. It was a slow, searching passage of his own composition. the kind he produced in the later stages of a case when the analytical work was complete and some further, less definable process was underway. After a time he rested the bow and said without turning, "The gravest danger in detection, Watson, is not ignorance." I waited. It is agreement. When every available voice, every newspaper, every official body, and every constructed piece of evidence points in the same direction, the temptation to move in that direction becomes very nearly irresistible. A single detective standing against the current requires something more than logic. He requires the particular stubbornness of a man who distrusts conclusions he has not himself arrived at. He resumed his slow passage. I sat and listened to it and thought about Fenwick's near confession, and about Lestrade's cheerful certainty, and about Mrs. Barlow's carefully premature pronoun, and about Miss Vane's Edinburgh father and her precise legal vocabulary, and about the neatly stenciled crates in the dark space behind the timber partition, undisturbed and utterly damning. I also thought about Croxley, the solicitor with the theatrical memory and the impeccable narrative, and found myself wondering how far his complicity extended, and whether it was the complicity of a man who had been recruited, or of one who had volunteered. These were not comfortable thoughts, but they were, I was increasingly certain, the correct ones. Holmes played until the light in Baker Street faded from grey to amber, and then to the particular blue-black of a London evening in late autumn. When he set the violin down for the final time, he stood at the window for a moment, looking down at the gas-lit street, and I saw in his reflected face in the glass the expression I associated with the end of the gathering phase and the beginning of something more direct. "I shall write 3 letters this evening," he said. "One to Lestrade, one to the relevant party at the Court of Chancery, and one to Mr. Percival Lethbridge, requesting the honour of his company at Baker Street on Monday morning. And if he declines—" Holmes turned from the window with a trace of something that was not quite a smile. "He will not decline, Watson. A man who has invested considerable effort in appearing to be cooperative does not become uncooperative at the moment when cooperation costs him most. That would draw precisely the attention he's been at such pains to avoid." I considered this. "You intend to draw them all together?" "I intend," said Holmes, returning to his desk and drawing out his writing paper, with the purposeful movements of a man who has reached the part of a problem he finds most satisfying, "to create a situation in which the truth becomes visible to everyone in the room simultaneously, including those who have taken the most care to obscure it." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, London continued its indifferent evening. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and sat with my pen poised, feeling for the first time in the whole affair that what I wrote upon it next would be the beginning of something rather than the extension of an uncertainty. Holmes, at his desk, wrote steadily and without pause, and did not look up until all 3 letters were sealed. Chapter 9. The Concealed Purpose. Monday arrived with the particular grey determination of a London autumn morning that has decided against any concession to colour or warmth. By 9:30, Baker Street was quiet in the way that precedes events rather than follows them, and Mrs. Hudson had, at Holmes's instruction, arranged our sitting-room with a slight formality it did not habitually possess. The central chairs positioned with some deliberateness, the side table cleared, and a second lamp brought in against the flat light from the windows. Holmes had eaten nothing since the previous evening, and had been dressed since before I came down, which told me, without the need for further indication, that he had not slept. They arrived in sequence, as Holmes had intended, each at a slightly different time, so that none of them had the comfort of entering together. Lestrade came first at 9:45, with the cautious expression of a man who has accepted an invitation he is not entirely sure he should have accepted. He had brought with him a constable, whom Holmes asked to wait upon the landing with a pleasant firmness that admitted no discussion. Croxley arrived 12 minutes later, dressed with the careful attention to appearance that I had observed at our first meeting. He glanced at Lestrade with a recognition carefully calibrated to suggest mere professional acquaintance, and took the chair indicated on the far side of the room. Miss Vane arrived at 10 precisely, which was itself a small communication. She was composed, her dark coat buttoned to the collar, her hands gloved, her expression set at the controlled neutrality of a person who has decided in advance how she intends to conduct herself. She sat without being invited to, which Lestrade, I noticed, observed with a slight narrowing of attention he could not quite have accounted for. Lethbridge entered last, at 3 minutes past the hour, and the 3 minutes were, I suspected, deliberate. The habitual authority of a senior man over an appointment he has graciously agreed to keep. He was, as I remembered him from Baker Street 3 weeks before, heavy and composed, with the professional gravity of a city merchant who has been publicly wronged. He looked around the room with a cordial puzzlement at finding the others present. "A full gathering," he said pleasantly, taking the remaining chair. "A necessary one," said Holmes, who had remained standing throughout. He moved now to the centre of the room with the unhurried precision I had observed in him at other such moments, and I took my station near the door as experience had taught me to do. He began not with an accusation but with a question, addressed to the room generally. "I should like to establish at the outset a single point of agreement. All of us here accept, I take it, that the bankruptcy petition filed in the name of Lethbridge and Company on the 15th of September was filed without the authorization of the firm's principal." Lethbridge assented with a sombre nod. Croxley said, "That was my understanding." Miss Vane said nothing, which Holmes received without comment. "Then the question before us," Holmes continued, "is simply this. If Fenwick did not file it, and the firm's principal did not authorize it, who did, and for what purpose?" He turned to the table where the documents he had assembled over the preceding days were arranged in a sequence that was clearly not accidental. He did not consult them. He had no need to. "I begin with the petition itself," he said. "I have demonstrated to my own satisfaction, and I shall now demonstrate to yours, that it was drafted by a person with knowledge of Scottish insolvency practice. The terminology in the third section is not English commercial usage, it is the formulation of an Edinburgh-trained practitioner. Mr. Croxley, you attended the University of Glasgow, and read law there before moving south. This is recorded in the Law Society's own register." He let this rest for a single beat. "Miss Vane, your father was an advocate in Edinburgh. He worked for 6 years in the administrative chambers of a Scottish legal firm before taking employment with Lethbridge and Company. You have, through that training, an intimate familiarity with the vocabulary of Scottish insolvency proceedings, which is visible in your language, in your interview with Inspector Lestrade, and in the petition itself." Miss Vane's gloved hands did not move. "I helped prepare documents at Mr. Croxley's request," she said, with a steadiness that commanded a degree of reluctant admiration from me. "I was told they were internal planning documents." "A reasonable position," said Holmes, "and one which may substantially serve you, depending upon how completely you are prepared to account for your knowledge of events. We shall return to it." He moved to the next document on the table. The timeline. Fenwick entered the Lombard Street offices at 7:30 on the evening of the 15th. He departed at 8 o'clock. The petition was received at court at 8:47. In the intervening 47 minutes, 3 people retained access: Mr. Lethbridge, Mr. Croxley, and Miss Vane. The petition was filed by one of them, using a document drafted with Miss Vane's assistance and bearing Fenwick's signature, which was obtained, I believe, through the simple expedient of asking him to sign what was represented as an internal administrative form. He has said as much to his solicitor, who did not consider the detail sufficiently significant to press. Croxley's careful face had developed across the preceding minutes the quality of a plaster mask, still adequate to observation but no longer flexible. Lethbridge, by contrast, had become more expressive, not less, producing at intervals the sorrowful attentiveness of a man following a puzzle in which he has only benign interest. Holmes turned to him directly. "The firm was not ruined, Mr. Lethbridge. It was performing a ruination. The inventory declared as lost in your bankruptcy filing has a market value in excess of £18,000. It is stored, at this moment, behind a timber partition in the third of your Bermondsey Arches, created under the name of the Hollandale Forwarding Company, which you registered 11 months ago and capitalised through an intermediary account at Hartley's private bank. I have the bank's own records here." He indicated the document at the far end of the table. "Hollandale is yours. The inventory is yours. The purpose of the concealed filing was not to hide the firm's collapse, but to engineer it, to create the legal preconditions for a settlement with creditors at reduced terms, allowing you to retire your obligations at a fraction of their value, and subsequently to repurchase your own assets through a subsidiary name, emerging from the process solvent in practice, while appearing to have been ruined in fact." The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart passed in Baker Street and the window glass registered it faintly. "Fenwick was convenient," Holmes continued. "His gambling debts were real, which gave the manufactured evidence against him the essential foundation of plausibility. The burned correspondence was yours, Mr. Lethbridge, destroyed to eliminate records of the Hollandale transfers. The cash found in Fenwick's bag had been placed there. He told his solicitor it was given to him for safekeeping by a member of the firm he trusted, and I believe him, since the sum corresponds precisely to a withdrawal from the Hollandale account 2 days before his arrest. The false panel in his lodging house had been fitted, I would estimate, some weeks previously, since the plaster at the bracket points is newer than the surrounding wall by a margin visible to close inspection, and the ledger planted within it was fabricated using marine insurance notation, a discipline entirely foreign to a textile accountant, but consistent with the professional background of Mr. Croxley, who spent 4 years in marine underwriting before reading law. Croxley closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in his expression had altered, and I understood with the particular sadness that attends such recognitions that he had arrived at a calculation. "He told me the firm would be rebuilt," Croxley said, with a flatness that was its own form of testimony. "A share in the reconstructed company once the creditors were settled. I prepared the documents. I filed the petition. I rehearsed my account." He looked at the floor. "I did not plant the ledger or arrange what was done to Fenwick's rooms. Those I was not informed of in advance." Lethbridge rose from his chair with a swiftness that contrasted sharply with the heavy gravity he had maintained throughout. He moved toward the door with a purpose that was entirely futile, since Lestrade was already on his feet, and I had, as I mentioned, taken my station there some time before. Lestrade's constable was, at my knock, through the door in a moment. The arrest was accomplished without violence or theatrical struggle. Lethbridge submitted to it with the air of a man who has performed one role so long that he can find no other to adopt, and the constable led him down the Baker Street stairs with a mundane efficiency that seemed, in its way, the appropriate register for the conclusion of so deliberate a deception. Miss Vane remained seated. She looked at Holmes with an expression that was not precisely relief, but belonged to the same family of feelings. "I didn't know what the documents were for," she said. "Not fully." "I believe you," said Holmes. "I should advise you nonetheless to consult a solicitor before speaking further to the police." "A solicitor," he added, with a quietness that carried its own point, "other than Mr. Croxley." Lestrade remained long enough to collect what he required, and to shake Holmes's hand with the unaffected warmth of a man who is generous in acknowledgment when acknowledgment costs him nothing further. He had sent for a second cab and went out with the air of a person rearranging, on the move, a great many previously settled conclusions. The room, when they had all gone, returned to its ordinary dimensions. Holmes stood at the table for a moment, looking down at the arranged documents, then turned away from them with the decisive finality of a man closing a chapter he has no desire to revisit. I looked at the empty chairs and thought about Fenwick in his cell, who did not yet know that Monday had changed his prospects entirely. "He will be released before the week is out," Holmes said, following my thought with the ease of the long acquaintance. "His reputation may not recover so quickly," I said. "Reputations," said Holmes, moving toward the mantelpiece with his hands behind him, "are rebuilt more slowly than they are destroyed. That is one of several irreversible asymmetries in the human condition. He paused. Though I observed that the newspapers which destroyed his will find the rebuilding of it considerably less newsworthy, which is a related asymmetry they will not trouble themselves to note. He said nothing further, and I did not press him. There was, I felt, nothing more that required saying about the affair itself. What remained was the recording of it, which I understood by then to be my own particular office in these matters. I picked up my notebook, uncapped my pen, and began. Chapter 10. The Certainty of Men. Harold Fenwick was released from custody on the Wednesday of that same week, 2 days after the scene at Baker Street, which had concluded with Lethbridge's arrest and Croxley's confession. I read the brief official notice in the morning paper and set it aside without remark, since Holmes had already known it would come, and had expressed no particular interest in the confirmation. It occupied 4 lines at the base of a page otherwise devoted to an account of a railway dispute in the Midlands, which seemed to me, in a way I could not quite articulate but felt with some force, to illustrate something about the proportions of public attention. The fuller account of Fenwick's exoneration, such as it was, appeared the following morning. It was careful in its phrasing, as such pieces tend to be when a newspaper is obliged to reconsider a position it has stated with some confidence. The charges had been withdrawn in light of new evidence. Separate proceedings had been initiated against Percival Lethbridge and Julian Croxley. The investigation continued. Harold Fenwick had declined to speak with reporters, which I thought well of him under the circumstances, and which suggested, despite everything, a residual dignity that his ordeal had not entirely stripped away. Holmes read the account at breakfast with the rapid attention he brought to all printed matter, then used the page to note an address he required for an unrelated matter, which was, for him, as complete a commentary as he was likely to offer. I called upon Fenwick myself on the Thursday afternoon at the lodging-house in Bermondsey, to which he had returned after his release. It was not perhaps strictly necessary for the purposes of our investigation, which was by then concluded, but I had thought of him with some regularity across the preceding weeks, and felt that the conclusion of a matter in which a man has very nearly been destroyed ought not to leave him entirely without acknowledgment from those who had worked on his behalf. He received me in a small sitting-room on the first floor, a thin, pale young man of perhaps 28, with the careful movements of someone recently returned from a considerable fright and not entirely persuaded the fright is over. He thanked me with a sincerity that was all the more affecting for being simply expressed, and asked me to convey his gratitude to Mr. Holmes, which I undertook to do. I asked him before I left whether he had understood at the time what had been done to him. He considered this for a moment, looking at the window rather than at me. He had not understood, he said, not fully, not until the constable came to release him and explained what had occurred. He had known that he was innocent, but innocence, in his experience of the preceding weeks, had felt like a private certainty nobody else intended to share. He had nearly signed the confession, he admitted, not because he believed it, but because he had begun, in his isolation, to distrust the value of his own conviction against the weight of everything arranged in opposition to it. I came away from that conversation with the particular unease that attends the recognition of something not quite confronted in oneself. The organised certainty of others, brought to bear with sufficient volume and persistence, has a corrosive effect upon private judgment that I suspect no man is entirely immune to. Fenwick had resisted it, just barely, and largely through the intervention of his solicitor rather than his own resolution. That he had resisted it at all, under such conditions, seemed to me deserving of a respect I doubted the newspapers would think to supply. Croxley confessed formally on the Friday, providing a written account that confirmed the essential structure Holmes had laid out on Monday morning. He had been recruited to the scheme by Lethbridge, who had first tested his reliability with a smaller and entirely legal commission before introducing the broader plan. The promise of a partnership in the reconstructed company had been what Croxley himself described, in the flat vocabulary of formal confession, as the determining consideration. He had prepared the petition, filed it in person during the window after Fenwick's departure, and provided the rehearsed testimony that Lestrade's investigation had so thoroughly accepted. He had known nothing of the planted ledger he maintained until after it was discovered, at which point he had understood that Lethbridge had decided Fenwick's conviction was preferable to the risk of an acquittal that might prompt further inquiry. This detail, confirmed by the timeline, placed the fabrication of the ledger and the fitting of the false panel as actions taken by Lethbridge alone in the final week before Fenwick's arrest. When it had become apparent that the accountant was maintaining his innocence with more persistence than anticipated, Miss Eleanor Vane's position was treated rather differently by the legal proceedings, as Holmes had implied it might be. She had prepared drafts under instruction, without being told their eventual purpose, and had confirmed details in her police interview, which she had been led to believe were accurate. Whether she had suspected more than she acknowledged was a question that the proceedings did not resolve with complete satisfaction, and I shall not attempt to resolve it here. She was not charged. She left London shortly afterward, and her subsequent history is not known to me. As for Lethbridge, he maintained through the early stages of the proceedings a posture of dignified indignation that I imagine his legal advisers had recommended, and which served him rather less well in practice than it might have done in a case with fewer documented particulars. The Hollandale Forwarding Company, the concealed inventory, the intermediary bank account, the registration documents bearing his financial signature in all but name, these were not circumstances that admitted of dignified indignation as a sufficient response. By the time the case came before the appropriate court, the posture had been quietly abandoned in favour of a more negotiated approach, the details of which belong to the legal record rather than to this account. I returned to Baker Street on the Friday evening to find Holmes at his chemistry table, engaged with something that produced a faint sulphurous quality in the air which Mrs. Hudson bore with the stoic resignation of long practice. He was in good spirits, or what passed for good spirits in Holmes, which is to say he was alert, not restless, and showed no inclination toward the tobacco and the low chair that I associated with his darker intervals. I told him about my visit to Fenwick, which he received with the brief, attentive nod he gave to things he considered important, but had already accounted for. He will find that the practical consequences of exoneration are rather more complicated than the legal ones, Holmes said, returning to his preparation. His name has been in the papers in a particular connection. The papers will not pursue it further. The people who read them will carry the first impression rather longer than the correction, which arrives without the narrative interest that made the first impression memorable. That is a melancholy observation, I said. It is an accurate one, said Holmes. Melancholy and accuracy are not mutually exclusive, as I believe I have mentioned before. He looked up from his work for a moment. He is young. He has at present a clearer understanding of the mechanics of professional betrayal than most men acquire in a lifetime. That is not nothing, Watson, though I grant you it is a harsh curriculum. I sat down and looked at the fire for a time, turning over the affair from its beginning, as I often do in the days following a case's conclusion, checking the structure of it for weaknesses or gaps that only retrospect reveals. I found none that I had not already identified during the investigation itself, which was, I suppose, as satisfactory an outcome as these things admit of. What remained with me most persistently was not the mechanism of the fraud, which was ingenious without being, in the final analysis, beyond the capacity of a careful and unscrupulous man to devise. It was rather the question of how completely it had nearly succeeded, not through the failure of the official investigation to work diligently, since Lestrade had been thorough by any ordinary standard, but through the success of a narrative which had been constructed to fit so precisely the shape that an investigation expects to find that it met with almost no resistance at all. The evidence against Fenwick had been assembled with the knowledge that investigators look for coherence. A coherent account, presenting itself with appropriate supporting detail, answers the questions that are asked of it, and it is only the questions that are not asked that reveal its seams. Holmes had asked those questions, not because he possessed any particular foreknowledge of the truth, but because he had refused, from the first morning of the affair, to accept coherence as a substitute for demonstration. I expressed some version of this thought to him before I retired that evening, wondering whether it ought to inform how investigators generally proceeded. He looked up from the chemistry table again, with that brief, precise attention he gave to observations he found worth engaging. Human beings, he said, possess an extraordinary appetite for conclusions. Once fed, they seldom inquire who prepared the meal. He turned back to his work. The discipline of investigation is not the acquisition of evidence. It is the refusal to be satisfied by evidence that has been prepared for your satisfaction. Any man may follow a trail. The difficulty lies in noticing, before you have gone very far along it, that the trail has been laid. He offered nothing further, and I had nothing to add that improved upon it. I took up my notebook for the last time in the matter of the concealed bankruptcy filing, wrote those final remarks as precisely as I could reproduce them, and sat for a moment looking at what I'd written. Then I closed the notebook, replaced the pen in its holder, and reflected that London, which had pursued this particular conclusion with such collective appetite, had obtained from it rather less than it supposed, and that the thing of genuine value in the whole affair had been demonstrated not in any court or newspaper, but in a Baker Street sitting-room by a man who had declined, from the very beginning, to be told what to find before he had finished looking. It is, I've come to believe, the single most important qualification a detective or any other reasoning creature can possess. Holmes has it in a degree I have never encountered in another person. I have seen it serve him, and others, well enough across the years to record my conviction that it is not merely a professional attribute, but something closer to a form of integrity, applied not to conduct but to thought. Whether that conviction will survive my next encounter with a conclusion that presents itself with great coherence and apparent completeness, I cannot with honesty say. I am, as Holmes has observed on more than one occasion, a creature of my impressions, but I write it down, at any rate, against the next occasion when I shall need the reminder